We are continuing our class on the Parent Trap, where we're looking at topics around specific parenting issues, techniques of how to speak and handle situations with our children, and also working on our own development as parents and how we work through different challenges. Barry Bovary and I have been teaching this class now for a couple weeks going on, and Barry did a nice job last week giving us an introduction into the 5 love languages. The first one that Barry talked about is words of affirmation, really using that as a tool for us to praise, compliment, show affection and encouragement to our children. This may be a concept that many of us are familiar with our spouses, but using it as a technique to facilitate positive behaviors, to be able to show affection in other ways with our children was a little bit of a different spin on it. So appreciated Barry talking through that. The second one was time. And as we've talked about in this class previously, a lot of the ways that our children feel love is spelled T-I-M-E. So the focused attention can be really important at younger ages and a bit more challenging at older ages. The third one is touch. So this concept of physical affection, hugging on our children. Barry mentioned one of his daughters. Really, that was one of the love languages that she connected with. And so using that as a way to provide positive incentives and support for that child, using physical affection and touch as a way to do that versus other ways like time or words. The fourth one, giving gifts or presents, using that as a tangible way to show a symbol of love. I know there are a lot of people that are very what we would call good gift givers. They like to give gifts. They put a lot of thought and effort and time into giving gifts, and that's one of the ways that they use to show love. A lot of people also have that same language of receiving gifts. They feel somebody really cares about me when they receive a well-thoughtful gift or even a card, things of that nature. And the last one that a lot of people have as well is this idea of acts of service or actions. Meeting the needs of others, whether that's cleaning up or doing a task that someone else has that can be a way of showing that, hey, I care about you. I understand that this is something that is important to you. It is on your list of things to do, but you have other things going on. And so therefore, I am able to show that I love you by taking that task on and completing it myself. For children, it can be things like washing clothes for your teenager. It could be like going and filling up their tank of gas. It could be helping clean their room, different things like that, making them dinner. Some of those things feel like they are our requirements, our duty as parents, but they are very much ways that our children feel secure. They feel that love that we've talked about in many cases. The 6th love language that I'm going to be talking about today is one that is a bit of a tough one, but also kind of fun at the same time. This idea of discipline and boundary setting. This is a picture from the Christmas story. This is Ralphie, and he's obviously getting a little bit of discipline. You can see the bar of soap in his mouth there. Many of us may also be connoisseurs of soap after our time as children. I know that I've tasted many different flavors of bar soap and also liquid soap, which is an experience in itself. But it's one of those things that, again, discipline is a method of showing how much we love our children. And when we think about Christianity, the scripture specifically talks to discipline as an important part of our raising and nurturing our children. I have 2 versions of Proverbs chapter 13 here that I'm showing, and the first one is the NIV version. And specifically, this verse speaks to why we should discipline. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. And I underline careful there because I think it speaks to the fact that we have to be sensitive. We have to understand those love languages. We have to understand what we are intending to accomplish through discipline. It's not discipline just for the sake of discipline. It's discipline for the fact that we're trying to grow and prepare our children for the eventual life under their own care. And in order to do that, we have to take appropriate steps. The second one, which I like the New Living Translation's wording here a little bit, is those who love their children care enough to discipline them, right? So it's showing that we love our children so much that we want to take the action to discipline them and viewing that as a positive thing in their lives and also as our role as parents. And so I think that's really important to see that as we're called in Scripture to make sure that we're taking care to discipline our children appropriately. And it's for their benefit. So the second part of this is what actually, discipline is. And Hebrews defines this as, discipline is, seems pleasant no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful, both for the parent and the child, to be quite honest. However, later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So again, many of us, I think as we think back to our own lives, as we've gone through growing up and having experienced discipline from our parents, at the time, we're very frustrated, mad that, my parents made this decision that I couldn't go to this party, or I couldn't do this task, or that I was grounded from TV, or that I had this toy taken away. But now as we're older adults, having looked back on that, understand the value and the importance that discipline had on our lives. Again, producing this harvest of righteousness. Discipline means that training, and training in many cases is in trying to help us improve. So I love the way that this lays that out there, because it is true, at least in my life it was, of being able to look back and see the benefit and the value of going through that type of discipline. So discipline and boundaries, what's involved in that? And I think it's very important to understand that it is never too early or never too late, both sides of the spectrum, to start disciplining or laying out boundaries for your children, whether that's a 2-year-old, having the ability to teach them what's right and wrong, and also being able to discipline at older ages. Again, if you haven't started that or are feeling some anxiety around that, this is what we're going to focus on today. This idea of guiding, teaching, training, and correcting is important because it's teaching values of authority. It's teaching, that life may or may not be fair, but there is an aspect of expectations and consequences associated with those expectations. Treating people how to be kind. All those things are tied up into this concept of teaching and guiding. The important part of it, though, is that we do want to understand that there is an aspect of structure that is required there. The training and correcting aspect of it has structure to it, and we'll talk through what that structure looks like. That there are unpleasant consequences if necessary. Again, the idea is that our children are suitable, are positioned and equipped enough to make good decisions, but understanding that the reason they are trained to do those good decisions is that they have a consequence that may be there that helps facilitate that decision. So why do we as parents set boundaries? Boundaries are important, again, as we've seen the example modeled from God and Jesus, is that it's important that we see this as a basis and foundation of unconditional love. It is important that we have those out there because, again, we want to make sure that our kids feel that unconditional love. And it's that balance of security and care that someone is going to give me that feedback. They're going to give me that correction. They're going to let me know when I'm right and when I'm wrong. It provides that level of security. They also want to know that there is somebody that's going to enforce it, and they need to know that we're going to do it consistently. And that gives them, again, this level of security, this level of structure that helps them understand there's a consistency of how we make decisions. The advantages is what discipline develops within our children is this idea, again, of self-discipline, that they are morally responsible. They understand the things of society. They understand the things of our household. They understand the things of Scripture that are appropriate, that are aligned with the morals and the beliefs and the teachings that we have, that they can model those same behaviors in themselves. The second one is a respect for authority. Again, we want them to be able to respect us as parents. We want them to be able to respect teachers, bosses, friends, all those other people that come in, as there's this level of respect, and specifically for authority, that we need to make sure our children understand. And then again, I can't reiterate enough, is the sense of security. Again, it demonstrates to our children that we care for them, that we have their best interests in mind. Now, in many cases, they may not see that for some time period we talked about, but it is important that they feel that sense of security that comes and is developed out of discipline. So what tends to hinder us as parents from setting boundaries and setting appropriate boundaries? It can be it can be exhausting at any age, whether it's small children that, don't understand what we're trying to teach them. It can be at teenagers that, that level of communication and frustration is at an all-time high because of that balance between responsibility and freedom and how we're trying to guide and direct decisions. it can be very tough. So it's not going to be an easy journey, and we've talked about that. Parenting is obviously a challenge for everybody. It's not smooth sailing. It's not going to be, but it's something that can be very rewarding. The second thing is we think that many cases, if I'm disciplining my child, that's not me showing them love, because I'm showing them, a strictness or a structure that seems to be counterintuitive to this idea of love and nurturing. But it's important, we're going to try and break that down here a little bit, right, is that the challenge of unconditional love is what helps us facilitate discipline in an appropriate manner. Many of us are worried that our kids won't like us. And we either have said it to ourselves or have heard it from our children as, you're a bad mommy, or you're a bad daddy, or using words like, I hate you, I wish you weren't my parent. Those tend to be sometimes common words coming out of our children's mouths, that we are afraid that our kids won't like us. Some schools of thought we shouldn't really care if our kids don't like us. We are in those situations. We are their parents, and we're there to help give them that structure and discipline. Now, we'll talk about that in the next slide a little bit of how to think about this balance of being able to enforce rules while also providing that love and that care. The fourth one is we're scared of that reaction from our kids, and it looks like a couple things. First off is that our kids are going to respond angrily or aggressively towards us, and again, that's a bigger situation of how they respond. In many cases, is them modeling our relationship. So we're concerned of how they're going to respond. The second part of that is we're typically concerned about that response in a public setting, whether that's a tantrum in the aisleways at Target because they didn't get a toy that they wanted. And dealing with that embarrassment that comes with it. Many cases, the kids aren't embarrassed. They're on the floor, worried about what they have number one focused on their mind, which is, I want that Paw Patrol toy, or those things that are consuming them. They're not worried about whether the kid in the next aisle over looking at the Legos is concerned that they're screaming and crying on the floor. We tend to feel embarrassed by that. In many cases, that affects our decisions and how we choose to discipline our children or evoke the consequences and things that we've put in place. And the last one is we may have had bad experiences as kids. Again, the journey that we're talking about here in this parenting class is not new. Our parents and their parents and the parents before them, generations have gone through this. And it's not an easy task. It does not mean that anybody has figured out the right methodology. And many of us may have some emotional or historical challenges because of what we've gone through. And so being able to break that down and understand that we have an opportunity to change that pattern to have an influence on our kids, again, goes back to this idea of love, right? Everything is rooted in love. We want to take the appropriate steps to show our children love and thus the discipline. So for those of you that were able to participate in the parenting workshop that we had, I guess that was February now. It was a really, really nice training and guidance from a very experienced person. Kevin, I think, will be posting those training sessions, at least the audio of them, if you want to go back and look at them. But the speaker did a really nice job going through some different parenting styles and breaking down what that means of how we think about discipline and boundaries as parents. And what they tend to fall into is on this quadrant type approach, where we're looking at, along the horizontal axis, a warmth level. A spectrum that is from not very warm at all, kind of this idea of cold or disconnected, to warmth where love, friendship, all those things are coming. And then on the vertical axis, this idea of firmness, where I am a level of firm on what I say and the structure that I've put in place, and the follow-through or rigidity aspect of being a parent. So firm to not firm. And the important thing before we get into each one of these is understand that on either one of those spectrums, extremes are very dangerous. So being overly warm can be a challenge, because then it becomes more difficult to discipline. Not being firm enough obviously creates some challenges when you really are trying to enforce something with a child. So we have to be careful, right? We're aiming for a balance. And sometimes we float, so we don't always fit into quadrant 1 or quadrant 3. But there is this aspect of some situational floating. But the important thing here is really to assess where you are today. Where do I believe my parenting strategy or my parenting techniques fall into which one of these categories today. And again, the idea here is that we're trying to establish authority in a healthy manner. We are the parents, we are the authority, we're not the friend. But how do we do that in a way that gives warmth, that gives that structure that we've talked about? And so again, aiming for that balance. The 4 types of parenting styles, and these are very publicly known. Again, if you do any type of research around parenting styles, these are typically the 4 that come out. They may have different naming conventions, but this is generally the consensus. In the top left is authoritarian. Again, very firm, not very warm, is what that looks like. Directly below that is uninvolved. So again, not very warm, but also not very firm. So again, very disconnected almost. In the bottom right, permissive. So again, very warm and friendly, but not able to follow through and be firm on the strictness aspect of it. Strictness is probably not a good word here, but firmness on the follow through. And then authoritative, which is this idea of warmth, but also minding the rules and supporting an idea of I guess, rule follow through. Most studies agree that we want to be migrating to that top left, the authoritative parenting model. And again, we'll talk a little bit about why that's important, but it's a good balance. And so I have an image here on the next slide I think helps kind of share what that looks like in each one of these 4 buckets. Oops, let me go back. So at the top left, you can see this authoritarian, right? So this is a visual way to see it. Really focused on obedience. There is an idea of punishment over discipline to some extent. So really a strict, firm, strictness is probably appropriate in this case, a strict type of approach. I'm very concerned that my child follows these steps exactly. Any deviation is going to require discipline and punishment, and tends to be a cold type of approach from an emotional perspective. So that can be challenging where you may see children respond in a negative light from being managed that way. Again, against authorities, not having that level of respect, or something in between. Directly below that is this uninvolved. So you can see the picture here, the dad watching TV, the child playing, there's no connectivity, no relation. Little guidance is coming from the parents on expectations. There's no nurture, there's no attention. It's kind of this model of children raising themselves to some extent. And again, this is the extreme we're presenting, but it is important to understand that this is reality in some cases, right? Is that disconnectedness and working through that. In the bottom right, this idea of permissive, which is, don't enforce rules. So the parents become more friends. So kids will be kids, they're going to do what they're going to do, and allowing the kids to make their own decisions, but not providing any consequences that follow through with that. And then at the top, obviously, the authoritative, which is this idea of what we're trying to really foster is a positive relationship with our children. Communication, discussions around expectations, love, using those love languages appropriate, and then enforcing those rules. Again, very specific on what those rules are, why they're important to us as a family, us as a parenting team, and what they are intended to instill upon our children, and being able to enforce those appropriately. So again, a good visual way to see this. Again, we're trying to aim for balance, not one of the extremes. And really specifically, if we can get into that authoritative type approach, which is really challenging for some of us to do, I think that's really a nice sweet spot of this combination of love, but also being firm when we need to be to enforce the models that we're trying to put in place with our children. Michael, you move it. Thank you. So consequences, when we start to teach them, where do we need to think about? Where do we start? And the first thing to remember is start where you are. Again, we're not looking to compare where somebody else's family is. We're not looking at the fact that I haven't been able to do it yet or haven't started yet. Am I able to do that? Yes, absolutely start where you are. The important thing, though, is really, if you are able to, is to talk with your parenting partner. Again, that could be your husband or your wife. It could be a grandparent. It could be a friend. It could be just yourself at that time. But it is important to engage and have that conversation, and we'll talk about that why in the next step. Remember, though, you're not trying to solve everything. It is important to think that you may be overwhelmed, but taking baby steps and working a process is going to be important to help you really start on that journey. As I mentioned don't compare to other families. There is no blueprint. Even your own family model that you grew up in may not be the right model for you going forward. Don't compare to the Joneses or the Smiths of how they're doing it, because that may or may not work for what your family is wanting to do. Okay, so be worried about internally, not what is externally focused here. Don't compare children to other children, whether that's children of Joey, the friend down the street, or your second child versus your first child. Children are very different. How they respond to consequences, what those consequences need to look like. Some may be more apt to follow. Others may take a little bit of coaxing. So don't compare children to each other. It's important to do that as you think about individual plans and approaches you need to take with disciplining each child. The next two here are important, right? Don't expect immediate results. It's going to take time. This is a process, right? Especially if you haven't started yet, it will take some time for your children to understand that something has changed, to get some clarity around the expectations, so that then they can work through that with you. And the last one, again, praising good behavior. This is a really important thing to do in general, as we've talked about in the previous classes around screen-free parenting and other things, is to make sure we're understanding we want to be praising positivity and good behavior as a means of reward for our children, so that we don't have to do as much negative enforcement. Again, that doesn't mean that we won't have to do that, but the idea is if children are seeking those rewards, more than likely they're not having to change their behavior related to some sort of negative output there. We still need to do that, and it may be appropriate, but hopefully it's less frequent when we're able to praise good behavior. So step one, how do I think about it? First and foremost is, again, working together and set that example. So again, it's important as you sit down with your parenting partners to understand, or yourself, to agree on what those boundaries are. And it's important that you find a time to do that when it's appropriate. It's not an on-the-fly decision when you're, decided, hey, we're going to start, discipline in this way and do it right away, or on the fly, I mean. Is to take a time, sit together, work through that, get aligned, so that then when the situation comes up, you're both prepared. And that's important because as your children get older, they will try and play you against each other. Hey, Dad, can I go outside and play in the mud? Well, if I say yes and their mother has already said no, then we're in this conflict internally between the parenting partners. Again, children are smart, but we want to make sure we are able to support each other. We're aligned, and that also means that in a case where one parent makes a decision that maybe weren't aligned on, is supporting it in that moment and having a follow-up conversation when the children are not around, and going back to that first point, which is agreeing on what those boundaries are and talking through that. And that's tough, right? Because then we feel like we failed as parents, or we've gotten disconnected, and that can create some animosity. So working through getting that clarity and that alignment is important, so that in the moment you guys are aligned, and then if not, having a separate conversation. The fourth one, again, goes back to what we've been talking about in the class period. Children are sponges, so it is important that we model good behavior, right? If I'm expecting my child not to get angry, but then I'm getting angry about X, Y, and Z, that one of my children chose to color on the floor, that I respond not in a manner that is contradictory to what I'm trying to train. If I am trying to teach timeliness and can't think of what the word is off the top of my head, but when I'm trying to get my teenager to remember that it's important that you be home on a certain time, or you be here at a certain time, if I am late to church, or I am late to dinner because of poor planning on my own part, is that modeling the behavior that my children are being expected to and held accountable to as well? So it is important we think through all those things as part of this initial structure that we're trying to set up. And I think the last one here is also really important, is understanding your family dynamics. And again, this is something that I think is important to understand, again, as we've talked about our own upbringing, how each of the spouses or each of the parenting partners has been raised is important to take into consideration, as well as understanding what the current makeup is of your family, whether that's a blended family. I grew up in a blended family, and there's some definite challenges there. looking back on it, and we still talk about some of it today, is I have 2 stepbrothers and 1 biological brother, is that there was this perception that one of my stepbrothers was, disciplined very differently than the rest of us. And that created some challenges growing up, and we had some, again, animosity or some things that created an added complexity to the discipline and consequences and boundaries in our family when I grew up. So it isn't something that is important to take on as a forefront of the conversation, as this is our dynamic, this is our family, this is what it means. The other part of that is you may have to overcome or have to fight some differences in a parenting partner that is not in your household. A parent that is, from the previous marriage that is off-site, and that child goes and spends time there, is that can create some challenges as well. So again, complexity is not uncommon. And I say that because everyone needs to understand, again, that they're not in this alone, but understand the makeup and complexity of your own family is important as you set this structure and the boundaries and direction that you want to go with your children. Step 2 is really coming back to creating that balance. Again, we're aiming for authoritative here. So we want to understand where and how we want to set those boundaries. So we want to avoid those extremes. I don't want to tend to be too harsh, but I don't want to be too permissive, where my children are doing whatever they want to do. And that is an inexact science. It is very important to understand there is no perfect parents. There's no perfect, you need to be right here on this dot on that quadrant. It is important, though, that you decide what boundaries you want to do. You have that freedom. That path is wide. So you have the ability to float back and forth where you need to based on different situations. Don't feel like I'm stuck here. It is a process. It is got feedback. You're going to get that feedback after each situation. How did that go? Did my child respond appropriately? Were we aligned on what we wanted to have come there? And adjusting and tweaking as you go. And that adjusting and tweaking is going to happen over the life of the child as well. How you raise a 2-year-old is very different than how you raise a 12-year-old is very different than how you raise a 17-year-old and the interactions you have as they're 22. So that mindset of always working on it has to be in place. So what that does is it brings us back to really understand where we're going to choose our battles. Back to what is important. What are the things that we are going to die on the hill for? To make sure that our children are appropriately steered in that direction. And so once we have that in place, then it's important for us to just be confident and consistent with those decisions. So again, alignment, but the follow through, the consistency of where we're trying to go is always in that process as we're working. And that's really important because we want to enforce the rules, but we want to have that positive relationship to where that dynamic is really healthy. And that's what we're aiming for, okay? The third one here is really important, is follow through. Again, this is where the wheels can fall off immediately. This idea of idle threats and warnings that don't have a follow through to them can really just undercut everything that you're trying to do and develop as a parent when it comes to boundaries and discipline, okay? Sometimes it's hard to do. That is a very fair assessment. We as parents sometimes feel guilty. We feel that pity. Man, I really, I think they really would have liked to go onto that park to play. But, I really would like to still take them even though they made a bad decision and I gave them a warning and a consequence and now I got to follow through with it. But they would really like to go to that park. It's easier many times for us to give in there. And so we have to be really, again, understand the impact of that, what it means short-term and long-term. It's a short play, that may be a benefit. The kid goes and enjoys the park, but next time I'm trying to enforce a similar model of behavior, I may not be able to do that. I may have taken 1 step forward and 2 steps back, or actually 2 steps back and no steps forward. So it's important to think about that. We're playing the long game, not the short, because we were in this for a while. Again, the second part of this, though, it is important, though, that you offer consequences that you can follow through with. It's probably not a good idea to say, hey, that vacation that we have planned to go to Disney World in July, if you don't clean your toys up or eat your dinner, I'm going to cancel it. Because let's be honest, you're probably not going to do that, and it's probably not an appropriate consequence for not eating your peas on a Wednesday night here in May. So think through that. Again, right? Consequences that you can follow through to are appropriate and if possible, tied to the behavior. So thinking about you've asked your child to clean up toys. Providing this is maybe a bad example, but providing a consequence that says, if these toys are left out when you go to bed, I'm going to throw them in the garbage because they're obviously not important to you. That I don't need them. I'm ready to get rid of them. Is to throw the toy in the garbage. And again, the child is going to feel that when they go want to pay for that toy, or when that toy goes in the garbage, is to understand the consequence there. But you have to be able to follow through with that. But it's also connected to that behavior. The child is not cleaning up a toy, therefore the toy goes away. And allowing that connection to happen from a natural consequence perspective. The other side, going back to again scream free again, is here we want to make sure we're following through without anger or lecturing. And this can be really tough to do. I find myself, especially with my 9-year-old, wanting to have this conversation, explaining all these things to him, and I tend to go on a couple times longer than I should have, or minutes longer than I should have. So being careful to, again, stay calm in the moment, managing our anger, because we do not want to show that as an appropriate means of response in this case. And we want to be careful not to lecture, because in many cases that can be detrimental. We want to get to the point, be effective in our communication, and try and minimize that where possible. And again, probably the number one thing in this whole thing is be consistent. Again, consistency eliminates confusion because the child is then able to understand when I don't show up at this time, this consequence is going to get evoked. I know it's going to happen. There's no question whether or not my parents are going to take the keys of my car away. So that effectiveness is maximized when the consistency is there. Again, there's some times where you're not going to be able to do that all the time, but where you are able to, you can increase the success and effectiveness. And lastly, the fourth step here, again, is this is a process. I've talked about it. You need to adapt. It's not the same methodology that I had when my child was 2 years old can be applied when they're 12 or 17. Right? So we need to adjust boundaries and consequences appropriate to the child themselves. Again, boys may be different than girls. Even two boys at different ages may have different opinions. One may be, needs a consequence that is really specifically associated with separation, meaning you need to go sit in your room on your bed and be away from everybody else, where another one may be more affected by taking away time watching a TV or playing with a toy. So thinking through the appropriateness per child, and then as the age progresses, the appropriate boundary and consequence that happens as the child ages. So again, we have the ability when children are small to exercise what we consider total control. That same approach is not going to work, though, when that child is 12. If I'm expecting total control, it just isn't going to happen. And it's important to understand that teenagers still need age-appropriate boundaries, but with a more limited rule book. You may have less rules or different rules or a very specific set of rules based on where your child is in that time. And as you think about that, again, as kids grow older, they need to be allowed to make more and more of their own decisions. That's the goal, right? Our goal is to allow them to be develop their own self-control, to be self-directed children, to make appropriate decisions. If we don't ever give them the opportunity to do that, they never have the opportunity to model or demonstrate or prove to us that they are able to do that. And so, again, think through that as we think about the overall goal there as raising children. So the last couple slides here, I wanted to make sure I kind of jumped through for those of us that are in different phases. Some of us may have children in preschool, some may have some in the 6 to 10-year-old, some in the preteen, and some in the teen, is to understand maybe some nuances there for each of the age appropriates. Barry and I had hoped to have this in a different type of group setting when we were doing this live and in person, but I want to at least bestow a little bit of what some of the learnings that I've taken as we've gone through some of the research and books and things that we've been using to give some specific tips that parents that are in these different groups may take into consideration. May or may not work for you, but I think could be very valuable for some people. So I love some of the quotes here. I think it evaluates where people are in each of these phases. It's easier to say no to a 1-year-old than to a 5-year-old. So if you start young, you'll reap the benefits later. So again, understanding the importance of preschool training as it goes through and develops that baseline and foundation as kids get older. What you're trying to bestow and teach at this age, though, is really that idea of right and wrong. what are the expectations for me as a parent of a preschooler? What are the expectations that child may be able to have? What am I trying to get them to learn? They're not going to be able to handle complex behaviors. We're really trying to understand what is appropriate for a 2-year-old to be expected to do. Cleaning up toys is probably in that, but being able to make good decisions about how to use technology or something is probably not something that's appropriate. It's important, some of the techniques that you can use here again to help provide guidance on that direction of behavior that you're looking for can be things like distractions. As a child is very upset about something here, at this age it is appropriate to use distractions as a tool to change the focus and get the child off of that specific emotion so that then you can continue to work appropriately. Providing them options, choices to make decisions that are, again, acceptable whether they make one option or another, but also still providing some of those guidance to give them the understanding. Rewards can be very important here. Again, if you do this, giving this type of reward, we're going to go to the store and pick out a toy. We're going to be able to do this and this. If you are able to sit quietly at the doctor's office while we do this, we'll go get a piece of candy. These are the types of things that you're using as incentives to provide good behavior and response. Again, using the positives to reinforce. And I think at this age it's very important to understand that your voice tone can be extremely effective. Again, how you say yes and how you say no, and then using elevated tones and volume and other things in cases of safety or when immediate response is necessary. Those are the times where you use voice and tone appropriately. And I think it's also important to understand that we have to differentiate a little bit here the difference between childishness, so children being children, at this age are still playing and young and they may not know the difference when they go pull a hair, that's not something that's allowed. Is working through that versus naughtiness. And what I mean by naughtiness is that understanding where you start to see they know what they're doing is then to start to work that appropriately versus childishness. Okay? So then that next age group is you've got the 6 to 10-year-olds here. And I love this quote by the father of 3 here, right? That's, to describe yourself, a father of 3, but I'm a city trader. My job involves negotiating, but it's a cinch compared to negotiating with my kids who use every trick in the book, right? So this is that age where you see the kids start to understand the options that they have and the decisions that they can make. But it's important to understand, too, this is a transition time for them. So they are going now where, in many cases, they're leaving the house. They're going to school. It tends to now have a little bit more of an outward focus where they're involved in things outside of your home, where school and friends become very important. They start to have feelings. They understand that other people have feelings in different ways than they do and within different ways that's in your family. So it's important to see that kind of transition and use that in an appropriate way. It also means that they are able to use words and hurt feelings probably more differently because they've seen and modeled different examples from people in school and things of that nature. So it's important to understand that they now have other influences besides just you. I think that's really the key takeaway there. It is important here also to use incentives. Again, that idea of building on good behavior. Having very clear rules so that you're not stuck in a situation where your children are negotiating. Well, yesterday we went to bed at 7:58. It's not 8 o'clock yet. Or tonight at 7:58. We went to bed at 8 o'clock last night. Being able to be able to enforce those rules, but having good clarity is important. I've even seen some examples where parents will use a chart. These are the very clear rules. If you lie, this is the consequence. Very written out. Boom, boom. And here's what that looks like, and being able to use that as a reference. So both the child and the parent have very clear expectations of what those rules are. And it is almost just like it is, it's probably more important here versus preschool that you keep your word. And I say the wording there, importantly, keeping your word. You said you were going to do this. You said you were going to have this consequence. You said this is what we were going to do. That means a lot at this age. And again, showing that consistency, showing that idea of love and support means a lot of things here when it comes to actually keeping your word and do what you're saying you're going to do, both in discipline and other things. And it's important here to label the action, not the child, right? We're still at that point where the child's action is something we're trying to guide and coach and teach on and correct. Is we don't want to put that in ownership on the child just yet. Again, that's a heavy thing to carry, so we have to be careful about how we communicate that. And again, very important as consistency across the board here, but avoiding the idle threats. So finding that right consequence. Again, it changes at different ages. And so at this age, it may be, again, something related to video games or being able to go to a friend's house or, X, Y, and Z. But make sure it's appropriate for the age and the child that you're looking for here. Because again, idle threats, that follow through of your word, this is a really important piece here at this stage. 11 to 13-year-olds. So again, here's where we're looking at this concept of now a little bit more flexibility. So this quote I think is really important of this type of transition stage here. So there are two things we should give our children. One is roots and the other is wings. So this is the point where children are starting to really spread their wings. They're getting more, independence is coming, or at least they feel it. We may not be able to grant it to them yet, but it is important. And it is important to remember that this is the time of hormones. It's normal. It's a tough time, though, for them. It's a tough time for us as parents to go through that. But it is natural. It's normal. Everybody does it. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. So the hormones are a piece there that are going to come into play that we need to think through. Balance of disciplining our children and steering our children. Understanding that, again, they're in a phase now where we have, again, lesser control than we did in the previous stage. So we're doing a little more steering. We're trying to put the bumper rails up to give them and keep them going in the path and direction they need to go so that hopefully they're straightening that out in a direction consistent where we would hope that they would go. And again, but it's important that that amount of freedom that we're granting is appropriate for the level of maturity that your child is able to handle. Again, that may vary very much by different children. One child may be able to handle a lot more freedom and has proven and demonstrated their ability to do that appropriately, where another one, has to have a bit tighter leash because of, again, their personality and some of the different things that comes with them versus the other child. I think it's also important here to understand to start strict and then extend that freedom. And I use strict here appropriately, right? Is that, again, we want to keep that leash short until the child has demonstrated the ability to handle that level of responsibility appropriately. And that means things like friend time, whether that's virtually or in person, limiting that and understanding how that is working. Responsibilities, being able to take out the trash, to clean their room. They can handle this type of responsibility, so I'm not concerned when they get to the point where they have a responsibility to do other tasks outside of the house and do it appropriately. Making good decisions, but still having the ability to have some adventure. Again, they're in this age where they're still having a lot of fun. They're enjoying the adventure piece of it. New experiences are coming out and doing that, but doing it appropriately. And I put the asterisk caveat here, though, because this is about the time where you really start to need to be concerned about parties. And I say concerned only because I think you need to be aware of what's going on and be very conscious of parties, who's there, the parents, what the plan is, the timing, all those different aspects to be able to appropriately understand if that falls in the field of play or not for that specific child. So be sensitive to it. This is really the age where that starts to happen. Again, trying to find the appropriate balance to be able to do that. Again, it's going to be hard. We may be able to say, no, it's not appropriate for you to go and have this slumber party or to go spend the night at this house because that's not something we're at a point where we're comfortable with, or it's not appropriate right now, or the things that are going on that we think are going to go on there are probably not appropriate. It's just being aware and being involved. And that understates the importance of communication here as well. And so as we think to teenagers here, this is really where we want to make sure taking some of the things that we've talked about here in the previous group and applying it in a broader sense. Really the point here is we want to guide without alienating. And so the quote here is, parents of teens face a difficult dilemma. How do we help when help is resented? How do we guide when guidance is rejected? And how do we communicate when any attention we show is seen as an attack? And so some of you teenagers, parents are going through this right now, are feeling that a little more than others. But it's important here to think that, everything goes better when we have happy teenagers. It can be really fun and enjoyable. But in order to do that, we really need to think about their needs and how do they feel loved. And so it goes back to Barry's comments from last week about 5 love languages. That doesn't just apply to your 5-year-old daughter. That applies to a 15-year-old daughter. And thinking about how they like to be felt like they're loved. Some of the things that are good examples here are book a date with your teenager. Have a one-on-one time with them where it's really able to focus and they feel that quality time. Again, time continues to be probably the most common love language amongst kids in general, is having that ability to demonstrate that outpouring and that love that you have can really help build and fill that bucket up in times where you need to impose some boundaries and consequences or discipline to that teenager. I think the last one here, the last two are really important, I think, as well. So maintaining communication. So this is the point where your child, again, probably has more ability to communicate with you than ever in the past. In fact, that they are understanding that maturity level of what communication looks like. But it is important that we avoid overreacting because we want to keep the channel of communication open here. We want to be able to talk through our concerns and their concerns with us because, again, they're at a point where they are able to reason and have conversation and understand a little bit, understand why I was raised this way, the reasoning of how we got here. And then keeping in mind that punishment may look different. It's really about reducing that freedom, again, dialing it back to help facilitate some of the challenges that we may have in that state. The last one here I think is a really interesting one, and again, I think this is one that I saw modeled pretty well in my wife's family, is this idea of welcoming your children's friends, providing that safe space for them. Still, probably to this day, if all of my wife's friends came into the town, they would have no issues going to Monty and Lisa's basement because that is just where they lived during high school times. And what that does is, again, it provides a couple things for us as parents, which are very nice. Is one, we know where our child is. Number two is we have the ability to interact with their friends, to really stay close without intruding. And then also some of the conversations and things that come out of that are really interesting and beneficial for us. The ability to influence their friends in ways, which is kind of interesting. But that love and that feeling that can be extended not only to your children but to your children's friends can really do a lot to put things in the bank of your child when it comes to that feeling of love, but also that feeling of connectedness and understanding. So a really nice tactic if you're able to do that. It can be very beneficial. So I hope that this has been helpful. I've gone a little bit long here, and I apologize. But I think it's important to understand the value and need for discipline and boundaries and consequences. Hopefully the subsets here allow you to think through where you are, both in your parenting style, which there's a lot of good information out there if you want to dig into more of that, or also some specific techniques for your age-appropriate child, and being able to take inputs and then form your decision how you choose to parent and where you want to go in the path to put your child in a successful role as a self-guided and self-controlled adult. But I love this, Hebrews 12:11, right? This is the one we talked about before, but this idea of harvest of righteousness, right? No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Painful. Later on, though, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace by those who have been trained by it. So again, thinking about the concept of peace. Peace for us as parents, peace for our children, and the value and importance of training. So appreciate it. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Barry will be teaching next week on a continued topic here as we finish out here in May on the parenting trap. We look forward to having you. And I know many of you probably already know, but we will be switching over to a separate link for worship here at 10 o'clock. So if you were able to log off and click over to that link, we'll be getting started here in a few minutes. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.